Good morning, afternoon, or everybody, or evening, everybody, depending on where you are joining us today for this live webcast hosted by Department of International Relations, Universitas Islam Indonesia. My name is Hangga Fatana, currently serving as the head of Department of International Relations, coming to live today from Yogyakarta. We are very glad that you are with us today, and we have over 200 people that are joining us from across Indonesia. We do hope that wherever you are, you and your loved one are safe and healthy. There's a lot to discuss today and limited time, so I'll keep this very brief. Before we start today's lecture, I want to remind you, if you are dialing in on Zoom, you have the ability to ask the questions using the chat function on the bottom of the screen. Thank you also for those who have submitted questions beforehand. We have them all on the list and we appreciate this. With that, let us jump into today's Ambassadorial lecture, which is about battling the coronavirus, Indonesia and Australia partnership. And through that, I would now like to introduce to you our resource person, His Excellency Gary Quinlan, Order of Australia. Ambassador Gary Quinlan is Australia's ambassador to Indonesia. Mr. Quinlan is a senior career officer with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, or DFAT. He was formerly Deputy Secretary and Australia's senior official to ASEAN and to the East Asia Summit. He was Australia's chief negotiator with Timor-Leste, I should say, on maritime boundaries. He has served as principal advisor to the Prime Minister of Australia on foreign affairs, defense, and national security, and has held senior positions in DFAT responsible for North Asia, the Americas, and Europe. Mr. Quinlan has previously served overseas as ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations in New York, Australia's representative on and president of the United Nations Security Council, deputy head of mission at the Australian Embassy in Washington, D.C., and High Commissioner to Singapore. Mr. Quinlan holds a Bachelor of Arts honor and an honorary Doctor of Letters from University of Newcastle. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ambassador Gary Quinlan.
Terima kasih for that very, very gracious, very generous introduction from Pak Hangga, who it's good to see online. Again, we're all doing so much work online that older people like me never realized we could do, and that we could exploit virtual communication so much more than we did in the past. Although I'm really looking forward to be able to do face-to-face meetings. They're so much more organic. But anyway, I'm looking forward to a really good question and answer session where I think we often get, the most usefulness out of contexts like this. So I must make sure I don't speak for too long, because my staff and colleagues tell me I always talk for too long. So please don't let me go on for too long so we can have some good questions and answers. It's great for me to be able to engage this way with University of Indonesia students as well, because it's almost a year ago now where I was scheduled to give a lecture in Jogja, and I caught the flu while visiting Jogja, and I didn't want to infect other people, so I had to cancel going to the university. So this is great that I've been able to catch up like this and do a lecture. Obviously, coronavirus, and I'll come to COVID more specifically in a moment, has just changed everything. We know that. Our world will not be the same again. Our region not the same again. But one point I did want to make is that even though it's had dramatic effects which are still unfolding and will continue for years to unfold, particularly the economic and social impacts in each of our countries, and then our regional capacity to shape events and so on, even though that will continue, there are fundamental trends which were there anyway, and which have really just been accelerated by COVID and perhaps made more dramatic. But those fundamental trends, which are huge geopolitical change in our region, geostrategic realignments as new countries emerge, particularly China emerges as a more and more dominant and influential country in the world and our region, the strengthening of Japan over the last decade has become a stronger country. India, which is assuming more and more strategic weight in the region. So all these alignments, and Indonesia, of course, Indonesia, all these alignments are changing, and it's very fast-paced, very quick, but fundamental, and those changes were happening anyway. All the technological change, we're seeing technological progress at the fastest rate in human history ever. Very difficult for any country and individuals to keep up with how quick that change is and how dramatic technologically, and then profound ecological and environmental change and social change. So all of those trends are there and have been accelerated by the impact of COVID-19. Why I'm mentioning them is because those changes have led to a new convergence in thinking by Indonesia and Australia together. Indonesia looks at what's happening in the region and the world. Australia looks at it, and we both make the same assessments about the nature of the change. Our responses from our governments and communities will inevitably be a little different for obvious reasons, political and everything else, but fundamentally, I want to make the point that historically, we're at a very historic point in Indonesia-Australia relations as neighbours. Because of all the change around us, the two countries have decided that each of us has decided that we need each other as close partners, not just neighbours, but partners, more than ever before. And this is not just a diplomat saying this because diplomats always try and sound optimistic, you know, this is true. And that, I think, is a really profound change, long overdue in the nature of our relationship. And it really is tremendously important and very exciting, in fact. I mean, it's good to be talking to an audience in Yogyakarta because I think a lot of people from older generations know, but not necessarily younger generations. But given the importance of Yogyakarta to Indonesia's independence movement, I wanted to just note at the very beginning that Australia knows Indonesia and Indonesian independence from Yogyakarta from late 1945. Whenever I go to Yogyakarta, I stay in the Phoenix Hotel. The Phoenix Hotel is where President Sukarno had his office, including a secret stairway to escape if the Dutch forces came in and caught him or wanted to arrest him. So all of that is a very exciting element of history. But the Australia, in late 1945, when Indonesia declared independence, 1 month later sent a team of diplomats to meet with President Sukarno to say, how can we recognize you? What are your plans? And is there assistance, medical and this kind of thing that you need? We were the first country to make any outreach, and we continued to support you up until and beyond independence, but leading to independence in 1949. And President Sukarno nominated Australia to represent the independence movement in the 3-country United Nations committee which helped negotiate independence. There was the United States, Belgium representing the Dutch, the Netherlands, and Australia representing Indonesia. So I just wanted to register the fact that we were a very young country ourselves then. We were only 45 years old, but we supported freedom, self-determination. We had just been fighting a world war for our own freedom and in the Pacific, and we did not like colonialism. And so we supported you strongly. So we began very, very well with each other, but also because we recognized that Indonesia's future would also be Australia's future, because we're so close together geographically and such big countries. We're a much smaller population, but both huge countries. We knew that your future would be totally interdependent with our future as an independent sovereign nation. And that kind of fundamental thinking still persists. And that's how we see both of us as close neighbours in the region. Inevitably, because we are neighbours, we occasionally have little frictions or little problems. That always happens with neighbours, even your next door neighbour and everything else in your apartment building or whatever. That's just the nature of things, and we're both hostage to occasional events. But fundamentally, each government puts a huge amount of effort into minimising those little frictions and problems that might happen from time to time. We've, in the last year and a half, both governments, which have very close relations, have concluded 2 transformative agreements in our relations. One is called a Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, which is the highest level of diplomatic definition of a relationship between countries. Indonesia has 3 such partnerships: with China, with Australia, with India. Australia has 4, with China, then Singapore. These are all in the last few years, then with Indonesia, and last month we concluded one with India as well. And the importance of that agreement is that there's a very precise plan of action underlying the agreement on principles, which commits both our countries to an enormous amount of activity every year into the future. Things we already do, but are now doing more of, subject to coronavirus, and that's great. So very detailed plans of action in every area of activity that neighbours do with each other. So, you know, maritime and defence and law enforcement, education, aviation, transport, agriculture, everything that 2 neighbouring countries need to do with each other, we're doing more and more and more of on a plan of action into the future. The plan of action was signed off in February this year, when President Widodo made a tremendously enjoyable as well as historic visit to Canberra, a state visit for a couple of days. The other transformative agreement is a new economic partnership between the 2 countries, which came into force on the 5th of July, so in the last week or so. Because although we're neighbours, for the first decades of our existence, we actually produced the same stuff. So we didn't have complementary economies, we had slightly competing economies, you know, agricultural resources and so on. Now our economies are much more diversified, and particularly the Australian economy. So we're more complementary, and we can now do, or should be doing, our businesses much more economically with each other, because we do need to diversify our economic relationships. We both are far too dependent in 1 or 2 key major global markets, and we need to diversify our supply chains, all of that. So the new economic partnership over the next 5-10 years really should change our relationship more fundamentally so that we're better integrated. Where we're weakest in our relations, I think, is the economic we need to do so much better with, but is people to people. And I particularly want to mention this, to university students and others, because the new generations in both countries are the generations who are turning this around. I mean, huge numbers of Australians go to Bali every year as tourists. COVID has interrupted that, but it will resume, and you'll have huge numbers of Australians going back, the largest group of foreign tourists to Bali. In fact, Indonesia is Australia's favourite overseas country for holidays, apart from New Zealand. And New Zealand's kind of, special family relationship. We're almost the same kind of country. But Indonesia, so big. But despite that, Australians just don't know enough about Indonesia. But the younger generation are dramatically changing that. And particularly because there's a big increase now in the numbers of Australian students going to Indonesia to study under what's called the New Colombo Plan. And that plan has been going now for 4 or 5 years. The first year was a pilot year. Indonesia is the country of choice for the majority of Australian students going overseas in our region. It's focused on the Indo-Pacific region. And Indonesia is the country of choice, studying all sorts of different subjects. But by the end of this year, in fact, 10,000 young Australian students in the first 5 years will have undertaken studies in Indonesia under that program. That's extremely exciting because it will change the people-to-people connections between our two countries. And I just wanted to say, when COVID is over and each of our countries lift the border restrictions again, so we've got student travel and exchange, we must not lose that momentum for the younger generation contact for study, but also for the new startup economic enterprises, where under our new economic agreement, there is a special focus on what we can do with the younger business entrepreneurs between our two countries. And this is the future for everything. Now, COVID-19, well, it's absolutely changed our world, as we know. It's the most significant development that our region is facing, the world is facing. It's unpredictable. Globally, we're all looking now to see whether there is the so-called second wave beginning in different countries as countries reopen their economies and come out of lockdown because of the longer-term destructive effects of economic lockdown and social impacts. So all countries are focused. Inevitably, countries have looked inwards at the beginning because everybody had to look after their own populations. What's happening? How widespread is the virus? What are the impacts? What is the impact on the economy? Have we got the social protections and assistance available to our populations? So we've all been focused internally, but at the same time, governments, key governments, and this includes Indonesia and includes Australia, have been focused on what's the regional impact and what can we do together to try and shape a response regionally and try and constrain the impact on our own countries and the regions itself in which we operate. So that remains a fundamental commitment, I think, certainly from our two governments in seeing what we can do. And Indonesia has taken quite a strong lead, both President Widodo, Ibu Retno, the foreign minister, of course, within ASEAN. And this is a good thing because ASEAN needs always Indonesia's leadership with others, with partners in ASEAN, but Indonesia's role in ASEAN is always fundamental, strongly supportive of that. So we've been focusing and talking between our two countries about issues where we can help each other. Our two leaders have a few times, obviously, over the last few months. Prime Minister Morrison phoned President Widodo about 3 weeks ago was the last conversation. I was present for the call just as an observer, not participating. It was between the two leaders, but it was look, they've got to know each other over the last couple of years, and they've established a really warm, familiar relationship where they can say things to each other and help each other in very frank, friendly, good conversations. This is an indispensable asset between leaders and between countries, and it's extremely good. Ibu Retno and Australia's Foreign Minister Maurice Payne talk to each other regularly. They WhatsApp each other. Diplomats like me always think, what are they talking about? Is everything all right? Yes, of course it's all right, but sometimes you don't get the full details of what they're doing. I think it's great because you need that kind of personal contact. And between two ministers who know each other well, and again, it's the neighbours. It's how neighbours should relate to each other. Sri Mulyani and her equivalent here, our treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, have been speaking regularly about what's happening with the Indonesian economy, what's happening with the Australian economy, what's happening with the ASEAN economies, and what's happening with the world economy. How do we need to respond, and how can we support each other in terms of those responses, including nationally, the question of Indonesia's fiscal response, for example, because of the pressures on the budget and all the rest of it. And Australia and Indonesia have, since the Asian financial crisis, 1997-98, have always had a very close relationship in terms of fiscal support. So discussions are underway in that area. Both Australia and Indonesia are G20 members. We're the only two G20 countries, and that's a special privilege, but also special responsibility within our region. So our leaders talk to each other about what more we can do to try and get momentum pushed through the G20. There are issues in particular about what do you do about access to a vaccine, and making sure that when vaccines are developed, that in fact they are going to be available and quickly to where they are most needed, and that we don't have some sort of mercantilist, monopolistic stranglehold on those kind of things. So Australia and Indonesia strongly supportive of each other in that area of global public health and try to guarantee questions related to access to vaccines. Also, Indonesia, of course, is developing its own research capacity to look at treatments and vaccines, the same as all our countries are doing. I'll be announcing later today some further money under our development program from our National Science and Research Foundation with partners in Indonesia to do work on that. So all of those linkages are very strong, and our defence ministers, by the way, talk to each other every few weeks. So Pak Prabowo and our defence minister, another woman, Linda Reynolds, they are talking to each other very regularly and exchanging views and finding ways in which our defence cooperation program, which is very active, can continue despite the impact of COVID. So a lot of work is policy dialogue is happening online, but we do want to see a resumption of the training that we do with each other and all of that kind of contact later in the year. So we're working very strongly on all of that. Australia, and I'll finish fairly quickly to allow questions and answers, has, of course, a development cooperation partnership with Indonesia. And ours is a unique program because it's a very genuine partnership. It's existed for decades and decades. And it focuses in response to Indonesian requests on Indonesian development priorities where you think, not us, but you think, there might be areas where we've had some experience and where we might be able to help. And I think because we've got to know each other so well over decades and decades of this kind of very practical, in the field, a sort of cooperation with each other, that there's a level of trust that is developed. And also an interesting aspect of that relationship is where we've made mistakes, obviously we make mistakes and so on, we're not afraid to actually say, well, listen, we did that, we made a mistake there, we did that the wrong way. So that there might be lessons that a partner like Indonesia can sometimes learn from some of the mistakes we've made in developing our own economic structures, our own social policies, and all the rest of it. So I think that gives us a more trusted sort of edge with each other in trying to get programming well developed. We'll still make mistakes in the future, but I did want to mention that because sometimes I don't think people realise that a good deal of the trust we have with each other in these areas is because we've made mistakes together over some programs, and then we work out, well, that went wrong, we'll do it better. The areas where what we've done is we have about a $300 million program, and we've pivoted or redirected that program, or large parts of it, not all of it, to Indonesia's COVID-19 response, because it's the immediate emergency needs and the medium-term needs that must be met, and that's where we're trying to offer our assistance at your request. So we've diverted around about $45 million immediately to some COVID response, and another $21 million on new initiatives. And these kind of things will continue in the future. The kind of assistance or support includes economic policy advice. We have a program that's existed for a very long time, working with the Ministry of Finance and other key agencies in Jakarta and at sub-regional level, sub-national level, doing analysis of what's happening in the economy, what are the economic trends, and how might a country respond to those. And this program sometimes comes up with recommendations. It's existed for a long time. Its big focus this year, of course, has been what is the impact of COVID? And what are the options, the policy options that any government may want to think about in how you respond? So we're not the only people, sort of thinking about these things, but we're doing that in partnership with our Indonesian partners. And so a lot of work on the policy advice, looking at how you adapt education to online systems, because like Indonesia, Australia is a very big country. We've got schools in very remote areas as well, and what have you. So we've had to spend a lot of time in our national development as a country on how you engage with remote learning and distance learning. So we've been working with the Education Ministry and so on how you switch to online and home learning. We've been doing some work with, we have a program which works with farmers, it's called Prisma, on ensuring good production techniques and so on. So we've been doing some work there to help ensure that that farm production continues and food security does not become an issue. We've been doing some work on social protection programs, where we have a lot of programs we've worked with Indonesia on in the past in how you get the right information and data about the populations you need to be able to help support. All our countries have had to wrestle with this, and develop systems to do that. And so this is an area where we've been doing work anyway for 7, 8, 9 years, but now we're really focused on a response to COVID. And we're doing a lot of work in supporting, the raising of money for infrastructure development, that kind of thing. We work with the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank to assist in some of those infrastructure projects to stimulate growth, jobs, jobs, jobs. Both countries need jobs, jobs, jobs. But we're also working very closely with the Disaster Management Agency, BNPB, because we always have. We've had a unique partnership, and we signed a new partnership late last year, earlier this year, and it's now very much focused on the COVID-19 response. And just to give you an idea, I'll read a statistic. What we're currently doing through that assistance is we're providing support for, funding for 13 special advisors to the task force on COVID, including in public health, policy development, communications, how you manage the data that's coming in. Data is a huge, huge problem in a crisis like this. We're supporting the Ministry of Home Affairs and the Ministry of Social Affairs with another 4 advisors on the public health and policy development aspects of responding to COVID. We're fast tracking technical assistance we give in Bali and Nusa Tenggara Timur in order to support some of the subnational activity there. This is an area of Indonesia because of the massive number of Australian tourists we're very familiar with and a long history with. And we're partnering, and I want to mention this in particular, with national organisations in Indonesia, NU, Muhammadiyah, UNICEF, the International Red Cross, under the chairmanship of Yusuf Kalla, the former Vice President, doing a terrific, tremendous job. We're partnering with these kind of community organisations who are helping to have build community resilience to support government policy in Indonesia and practice for response to COVID-19. We're doing a more limited contributions on medical equipment and so on, but there'll be some extra support both in terms of ventilators and PPE masks and so on in the next few weeks. And some of that is being targeted to specific areas that have identified need within Indonesia. So obviously we're doing some work to help there. I think they are the sort of key areas of where we're working together. So politically, to mobilise action in the region to try and shape and limit the effects, the destructive effects of COVID as it continues to unfold. So very strong political support to each other. Support through our development assistance program in request to specific areas where you think we might be able to help each other. And of course, this discussion about the future directions of our economies as they're responding at the macro level, the fiscal level. These are very, very key areas of support. It's bad, and it continues to get worse globally. COVID, Australia is, we've had a lot of success in suppressing, we use the term suppressing, the initial transmission of the virus. We're not having a second wave at the moment, but we do have a sudden explosion of new cases in the state of Victoria, Melbourne, and this is now starting to affect other states in Australia as well. So, and we're in winter at the moment as well, which may have an effect. We don't know. It's possible that there are seasonal variations with this virus. The doctors don't know enough about the virus yet. But the more and more we learn, the more and more we worry. But the more and more we learn, there are new things we can try and exchange information about and do with each other to make sure we're taking whatever preventive actions we can. But at the moment, Australia is still has closed borders, international borders, and that is likely to remain the case for a while because we're now experiencing a new kind of growth of COVID cases. So that's a bit unpredictable for the next few months. Our initial focus on reopening the borders has been on international students, and this is why I'm mentioning it to an audience like this. And we were hoping to have some pilot studies of students coming back in, because there are a lot of students already in Australia from overseas who have just been doing online learning during the COVID crisis. But the new students wanting to come in, it's a bit uncertain exactly when we'll be able to enable that to happen now, because we've suddenly got these new cases of COVID and the quarantine arrangements obviously continue in place. So it's uncertain for you, it's uncertain for us. And a diplomat will now speak and say that uncertainty means we've just got to do more and more and more and more with each other. But it's not only a diplomat saying it, it's obvious. That's what we have to do. I've spoken too long. You should have stopped me, Pakanga, but please, delighted to answer any questions and get people to give me their own experiences as well, please.
Thank you, Ambassador Quinlan. That was a very inspiring lecture, and it is always a pleasure to see that Indonesia and Australia has a very strong and sustainable partnership. Now we are moving on to the question and answer. Ambassador Quinlan, we have one question from Raihan Shafa, one of our students. I would like to ask a question related to the SEPA. We understand that the Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement brings benefit for both of the country. However, there might be some challenges on the way. Either Indonesians or Australians are not really aware of each country's products, which lead business practitioners for not sharing nor showing their interest to create a trade scheme in each country, worsened by norms, culture, and society differences of each country, not to mention the existing public prejudices. As for Australian, how does Australian government try to cope with this problem, Mr. Ambassador?
Look, it's an excellent question, obviously, and it's a realistic question because, as I said in my presentation, the biggest weakness, if you look at our relations as neighbours, is we just don't know enough about each other, and that is changing with the younger generation. But inevitably, there are deficiencies in what people generally know about each other. And both governments, try and deal as best they can with that by just getting on and doing government-to-government business. The high-profile visit by President Widodo this year was extremely well covered in Australia and had quite a telegenic effect because he addressed the Parliament, and it was a very successful presentation, and it had an effect. It had an effect. I mean, I saw this in public commentary, in social media, and all the rest of it. Old attitudes take a while to change, and often it's not kind of malign or prejudice, for example. It can be. It can be in either country or whatever. It just can be. But often it's just ignorance. And it's always so difficult to change people's attitudes for governments to try because it takes a long time. It's education. It's media presentation by both countries. It's more tourism. It's all those things, but they have a long-term effect. Now, I actually think IA-CEPA is going to be the most dramatic way we change popular perceptions of each other because it's economics, it's business, and it's new business, including in the digital economy for the future. So, and new startups and all the rest of it. So we have to make it work. Now, one of the things that worries me is that a significant part of the new program for the short to medium term benefit to Indonesia was the very important skills packages. So giving more worker holiday visas, going from 1,000 to 5,000, and then we'll increase beyond that into the future over the years as well. That's now held up because we've got border restrictions and no travel. So that was going to be, I think, potentially year by year, a really significant element in developing a new kind of ecosystem for business engagement. There were skills packages for Indonesians coming down to spend time with Australian industries and businesses, or businesses that may be international but operating in Australia over periods and all the rest of it. Those components are still there in CEPA, but it's a bit uncertain when we're going to be able to initiate it because of the border restrictions. And that's what worries me most, that we're going to be losing time, and we don't have time to lose because each of our economies is at a critical point to get out of the COVID and effects of COVID. So that's a big worry. Both governments are heavily engaged, I've got to say, in talking to the business communities and a lot of public campaigning. I participated in a WebEx, a Zoom event last week with our Minister for Trade and Investment, Simon Birmingham. There were 1,600 Australian business people tuned in to that event. I didn't speak. I was one of the 1,600, but observing and listening and learning, hopefully. But it was a very powerful indicator. I was surprised by the numbers, genuinely surprised, of interest, new economic interest. And given the impacts of COVID on our economic thinking as countries, and countries like you and us thinking, we do need to diversify, our economic partnerships, and we do need to diversify our supply chains. There are new big incentives, more than just business, in governments working with business to achieve that kind of end. So I actually see this as an opportunity, but you can't do enough of it. And we've got to keep talking to business. And certainly we're doing it. I'm doing another one of these WebExes next week. I think there are currently, 400, people have signed on, not because of me, but because because the business areas we're going to be talking about, with a big focus in particular on digital opportunities and startups. I mean, this is the future for both our economies. And look, it's a worry, but we've just got to keep working at it.
Yeah. Thank you, Ambassador Quinlan. It was surprising to see that 1,600 people joining the WebEx forum and discussing about the potential partnership for trade. And we have the next questions, Mr. Ambassador. This is from Ahmad Priyansyah. Mr. Quinlan, how do you see the effect of trade war between China and United States for the future relations between Indonesia and Australia? Because as we know that day by day, Indonesia has a closer relations with China, while on the other hand, Australia long and strong relations with the United States. What do you think about this?
Yeah, look, any trade war in general is bad for the world economy. And we all know, all of us in the region, Indonesia and Australia, we look at relations between the United States and China, and which are in strategic competition is the phrase that is used. And that worries us because it could go wrong. So every aspect of it worries us. And we're a close partner of the United States, but we're also part of this region. And, we become hostage to developments which we don't want to get out of hand, strategic developments. So I just want to make that clear. The Australian government issued the last week, was it the week before, a new major strategic assessment, national policy, to update all of our defence work in the region, in the Indo-Pacific, to enable us as a country to be more resilient with other partners in the region. I'm not talking about resilience with the United States or whatever, but resilient with each other, being able to help each other a great deal more, because there are whole new areas of, developments in relation to militarization and misuse of cyber and all the rest. But this was recognizing the fact that US-China relations are fundamental for all of us and could go bad. And we just don't want that to happen. So I would make that point. Trade wars are bad, but sometimes, there has been a sense, well, there may be some opportunity, as, for example, in the case of some people who have investments and production facilities, for example, in China, might decide they want to relocate elsewhere. So I know Indonesia has looked at that and has been encouraging other companies, should they be deciding to relocate, to come to Indonesia. That's going to require a judgment by companies like that of what the economic circumstances in Indonesia are. And President Widodo has been very focused on that, to ensure that the investment climate is receptive. So those kind of opportunities occasionally open up as well. Because of COVID, we've sort of lost sight of this trade war and all the rest of it, but it's still unresolved. I mean, there were some temporary agreements, but those agreements, because of everybody's preoccupation in the US and China with COVID, are not necessary. They're sort of on hold. So we're sort of waiting and watching to see how that develops. In our own case, we just get on the same as Indonesia and try and develop as much business activity as we can. We do have a focus on the region, but the key always is getting our businesses, to look more positively. That's in Indonesian business and Australian business, at the opportunity. And it's business decisions in the end, because trade consists of individual business productions and so on, which are then exchanged. So it's pretty hard, but like both of us, we're both keeping a very close eye on it. And one area I might mention is the World Trade Organization, which both Indonesia and Australia regard as fundamental to world trade laws. And we're very worried about the fact that the WTO is being weakened by United States actions and by some others, of course, as well. So Indonesia has taken a very strong lead in helping to work within the WTO for reform of the WTO to make it more effective. So, and Australia is working on this as well, but Indonesia has taken a really strong lead as well. So we don't lose the WTO, because then we'll be in a very bad situation globally in terms of trade rules.
Yes, thank you, Ambassador. You have mentioned earlier about the Indonesia and Australia partnership on development, and there is one question from our student asking about this from Agus Zuriana Putra. He asked, will the partnership in education, particularly Australia Awards, will continue?
Pak Agus, thank you for the question. The answer is yes. What our people running the Australian Awards program have been doing, of course, is looking at different formats online, again, without throwing the benefits of the Australian Awards out, but looking online to maintain some kind of momentum for those awards over the next 6 to 12 months. We're extremely anxious to see that. We do not want to damage that Australian award system. It has been so successful. Its beginnings were in 1953. It's the oldest scholarship program between any two countries in the world ever. It's evolved, and we must not lose the power of that. But the Australia Awards are individual, kind of scholarships and things for students, but also Australia Awards do a lot of short-term courses for groups of people who get an award on something which might be particularly valuable, whether it's in cyber, financial management, how you run a sort of economic policy advice issues, and many other things. So we're looking very much at seeing how those kind of programs can benefit from some online activity while we wait to be able to resume the face-to-face engagement and travel again. I know a few people in Jakarta who are just waiting, to get down to Australia to begin their Australian Award program in digital photography and various other things, but are just held up now because of the border. So the answer is yes, but there is a moment of pause now because of the impacts of COVID-19. But the answer is yes, we will not lose that program, but it's a bit paused at the moment.
Thank you, Ambassador. So Agus is not, it will continue, but it will be paused at the moment. The next question is from Fauzi Wahyu Zamzami, Mr. Quinlan. How should Australia and Indonesia branding their nations during the pandemic? Because the public diplomacy between two countries is very much needed during this pandemic.
How should we brand? It's an interesting question. It's a very interesting question. I haven't actually thought of it from that perspective. Look, I think fundamentally, if you're talking about both of us, we're branded as neighbours who are just neighbours. So that what happens in Indonesia affects Australia, and what happens in Australia affects Indonesia. For example, when tourism starts flowing again, it's not just Indonesians coming to Australia, but it's Australians going to Indonesia. So that contact and close contact at a personal level will exist again physically. And in the new world of COVID, because we don't quite know how the COVID pandemic is going to settle down, how many people are going to be infected. We do know that very large numbers of people who get infected appear to be asymptomatic and not acutely ill. But then, of course, there are those who are acutely ill and, of course, those tragically who die. So it'll be out there. It's you know, as we all have to recognise, and as President Widodo said earlier on, we're going to have to do absolutely everything we can to protect people's health, but it's a new reality in the world we're going to have to live with over time. We just don't know how strong or widespread the virus will be in another year, 2 years, 3 years. It may be a weaker virus. It may be like the flu. We may have a vaccine and what have you. So I think really the branding is two neighbours, each doing the best they can to protect their own citizens while not losing sight of the fact that we still have to try and shape the world that both of us are in, but that we are cooperating during this period closely, which we are. And I think the example is because you are such a large country, the fourth largest country in the world, there needs to be an appreciation, I think, that by people that inevitably, you know, the impact in bigger countries will be bigger because of population and everything else. So a sense of resilience together. I don't have any other magic formulas, but I must say I'd love to hear if...
The resiliency. Okay, thank you, Ambassador. In relation to that questions, we also have question from Putri Citra Pratama. Given all the understanding, all sensitive issues, and also misunderstandings, how can both countries, Indonesia and Australia, still put the trust on each other? What is the most strategic and crucial step to do so?
Yeah, look, you know, I think, and this will sound maybe a, you know, sort of diplomatic answer or something, is just to keep working closely in so many different areas of activity. What you know, since I've been ambassador for 2 years, and one area in particular where I thought we needed to do a lot more with each other was in our institutional contacts between our universities, our research institutions, and do stuff together, do projects together, do research together. And because this is the professional community, both with an interest in doing something, and then when you do it together and you produce a success, it builds up, you know, it comes from here and it builds out right across professional communities and so on. So you incentivize each other in what you can do together and being successful together. And that's the kind of thing I think we need to do more of. And it's the young generation, you know, like the questioners, doing more and more and more between younger generations in terms of visits, when we're able to visit, education of any kind, any educational contact of any kind, but utilising all the modern technology of social media, in which young Indonesians are among the cleverest in the world and certainly widespread users, using that kind of engagement positively, not the negative aspects, all the time with contacts in Australia, and building up that kind of new cohort of young people who know more about each other. That's the only way through it. If you look at our relations politically, you know, they're at a very, 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 very high point. There are no, you know, we have different views about certain issues and subjects in the world, but fundamentally, there are really no fundamental differences. Occasionally people say, oh, Papua, you know, the Australians, you know, have a problem about Papua and so on. We don't. Obviously, no one wants to see people attacked, like soldiers have been attacked in Papua and killed, and others, but no one wants community dissension like that. Leaving that aside, Australia is very strongly committed to Indonesia's territorial integrity and sovereignty. If a problem happened for Indonesia with your territorial integrity, that would have a direct impact on Australia. We would have a nightmare. We wouldn't sleep at night because you are so fundamental to the stability of the region. geostrategically. You are fundamental to it. You're vital to it. And when we look at the world, we see Indonesia as having absolutely a vital role in that respect. So, so some people say, oh, you know, maybe Papua is a problem, and it's not perfect in, you know, what have you, but it is not a fundamental problem. And I just want to make that clear. Obviously, we respect human rights, but it's a very difficult issue there. You have so many local social divisions and their economic distinctions. It's a complicated situation, but fundamentally, Papua and the Papuan provinces are fundamentally part of Indonesia, and that's it. And that's the only kind of issue that people occasionally mention to me. And I say, look, strategically, no way. Territorial integrity of Indonesia is fundamental to Australia.
Thank you, Mr.
So we've got a good ecosystem. Yes. We just need to do more and more and more of activity with each other.
Yep. I believe that we will have a stronger and also more sustainable relations in the future. We have limited time, Mr. Ambassador. Can I have the last 2 or 3 minutes for your closing statement?
Well, thank you for you know, this great opportunity, because I mean, you know, one thing when I arrived in Indonesia 2 years ago, I spoke to you know, I called on some of the other ambassadors in Jakarta to introduce myself and say, this is who I am. Hello, you know, tell me about Indonesia. How long have you been here? And there was one very senior ambassador who I met with in the first couple of weeks when I arrived in Jakarta. So it's May 2018. And I said, what's your key message to me as a new ambassador? Now, this ambassador had been there for, I think, 2 years, 2.5 years already. He said, Gary, number one, get out of Jakarta as much as you can across the archipelago. Well, that's obvious. You should always do that. And an Australian ambassador. And, you know, we have offices in Surabaya, Makassar, Bali, and so on. And he said, and whatever you do, meet as many young Indonesians as you can. Right. And he said, and I'm quoting him, he said, they are exciting, smart, cheeky, frank, you're honest, you know, and will tell you things, and they'll show you the future of the country. And it's an obvious comment in one way. Of course, the young people are the future of all our countries. But that was he said, meet as many young Indonesians as you can, because you will always love the experience. And so I've tried to do that in the last couple of years. And that's why I love engaging, you know, through various formats, usually face-to-face. But if we have to do it remotely for the moment, let's do it again. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Quinlan, for the inspiring lecture. It's always a pleasure to have you here with us. And we also would like to thank you for good relations and also partnership with Universitas Islam Indonesia over the last few years. And we hope to continue and also strengthen these relations. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. This is the end of our ambassador lecture. And the last message is stay safe, stay healthy, and optimistic.
Okay.
Thank
Terima
you.
kasih.
Terima kasih, Pak Duta Besar.